The tools of the trade. I'm stunned by the weaponization of behavioral psychology over the last 5 years. Anonymous scientific advisor deeply embedded in Whitehall. COVID-19 is not the first time the UK government has frightened us for public health reasons. A standout example is the "Don't Die of Ignorance" campaign about AIDS in 1986. It was a powerfully chilling television and leaflet campaign, and still haunts our memories. According to the campaign, AIDS had an explosive infection rate, and it was predicted that millions of Britons would become infected. Sound familiar? In another parallel with COVID-19, the media coverage was a cacophony of doom. Fear and Death Cell. The Chief Medical Officer, Donald Acheson, and the Health Minister, Norman Fowler, pushed to create a hard-hitting campaign that would convey that everyone was at risk, rather than particular groups being more at risk. Similarly, our government has done very little to explain that risk from COVID-19 varies according to age and comorbidity, and as we know, there was an intention to increase our perceived level of threat. In the early days of the AIDS campaign, the message was given that anal sex carried the highest risk and should be avoided altogether, which was an unrealistic and overly prescriptive expectation. That message was soon replaced by the advice to use condoms for safe sex. Advice which doesn't take human nature into account is harder to follow. The focus on death aimed to frighten people into changing their behavior. People still remember the ad and the feelings it conjured. I know I do. As a 13-year-old, the haunting campaign imprinted on me that something was very, very dangerous. 3 years earlier, I'd had to pretend to the cool kids in primary school that I understood the lyrics to the Frankie Goes to Hollywood song, "Relax, Don't Do It." I didn't quite understand this campaign either, but it was frightening. Rather like the messaging on COVID, the AIDS advertising elevated fear but did not provide balance. People with HIV had to live with the disease, and still do, and the campaign did nothing to calm their fears. I imagine it must have been frightening to see the tombstone and loaded messages for those who were living with a positive diagnosis. Perhaps it drove the fear and social ostracism which people with HIV experienced. The British TV series It's a Sin about the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s has provoked people to write about the terrible fear that they felt at the time. One nurse recalled the fear, the isolation on the wards, gowns, masks and gloves to enter a patient's room. I spoke to doctor and public health expert Jackie Castle about her recollections of the AIDS campaign. The fear was controversial at the time. She told me, people in public health generally thought they were terrible adverts. But they seemed to have an impact and it changed what politicians would talk about, such as condoms and sex. There was a sense that it was a success, but we didn't like the fear. Similarly, how many people have been terrified by the thought of COVID, even though for the vast majority it is not very dangerous? As a reminder, Patrick Vallance told The Nation on the 13th of March 2020 that the vast majority of people get a mild illness, but just 10 days later, Boris Johnson warned of the devastating impact of this invisible killer. The messaging mutated faster than the virus or the scientific evidence. Research showed that the AIDS campaign changed people's behavior and the government considered it a success. However, some critics felt that it created panic rather than a proper understanding of risk and that it was actually grassroots organizations, such as the Terence Higgins Trust, which did more to slow the spread of infection among the impacted groups of people. As Castle told me, what really made a difference to the people at highest risk was the gay community action and activism. The government's big success was needle exchanges for drug users. Is it ethical to use fear if it is in our best interests? For the sake of our health? Some would say so. As the Behavioral Insights team report, Mindspace Influencing Behavior Through Public Policy, says, if we can establish that the behaviors do reduce well-being, the case for nudges is compelling, while also acknowledging that it is controversial. In other words, the ends justify the means, even if the public wouldn't like it if they understood they were being hoodwinked. And does the government claim credit for its own campaigns rather than honestly attributing credit where it is due? Norman Fowler said of the AIDS campaign, there was no time to think about whether it might offend one or two people. And history shows we were right. People took care and HIV cases went down. What about the Tarrant E. Higgins Trust or other grassroots organizations? Might a different sort of campaign also have encouraged people to take care without scaring everyone witless? Since the AIDS campaign, the use of behavioral psychology has become more formalized and deeply embedded in government. The Behavioral Insights team has a couple of handy acronyms to detail its methods: EAST, easy, attractive, social and timely, and Mindspace. I'm going to zoom in on the effects described in the Mindspace document, as it offers more detail. Messenger. We are heavily influenced by who communicates information, including their perceived authority, our relationship to them and how we feel about them. If the messengers are perceived as possessing high levels of authority, or to be worthy of admiration, people will be more likely to believe them and follow their advice and directives. Think of NHS frontline medics relaying the importance of staying home to protect the NHS. Incentives. Our responses to incentives are shaped by predictable mental shortcuts such as strongly avoiding losses. Incentives are not just financial, although they can be, such as fines, but can be the costs and benefits of behaving certain ways. Norms. We are strongly influenced by what others do. The power of norms comes from the social penalties for non-compliance, or the social benefit that comes from conforming. Being deviant can feel highly uncomfortable. Would you rather be a COVID hero or a COVIDiot? The government has repeatedly used normative pressure throughout the coronavirus crisis to gain the public's compliance with their escalating restrictions. Defaults. We go with the flow of preset options. We stand on the dot in the supermarket. Salience. Our attention is drawn to what is novel and what seems relevant to us, from flashing roadside signs reminding us not to travel too late, to relatable data and statistics, such as risk of deaths. Priming. Our acts are often influenced by subconscious cues such as sights, for example, face coverings, words, hands, face, space, and sensations. Again, wearing face coverings, causing us to behave differently. This is one of the least understood of the Mindspace effects, and has led to considerable controversy, not least to the slightly sinister idea that advertisers, or even governments, might be able to manipulate us into buying or do things that we didn't really want to buy or do. 8. That indictment is from the behavioral scientists themselves. Affect. Our emotional associations can powerfully shape our actions. Our emotional state significantly influences our mental processes and behavior. This mood congruence effect will result in a person selectively noticing and remembering information that is consistent with an existing mood. When happy, you are more likely to remember past successes, to notice the positives and develop optimistic beliefs about the future. When sad, you are more likely to remember failure and loss, notice the negatives and subsequently harbor pessimistic beliefs about yourself and the world. When fearful, your memory will be skewed in favor of past scary events. Your attention will selectively focus on potential dangers in your current environment, and your mind will be swamped with thoughts about future threats and potential disasters. This recalibration of our minds towards the fear mode has been exploited by the government and the behavioral psychologists to ensure mass compliance with the emergency laws and rules. Commitments. We seek to be consistent with our public promises, and reciprocate acts, agreeing to commit to a goal or commitment if someone else does. Ego. We act in ways that make us feel better about ourselves. We all strive to maintain a positive view of ourselves and, in so doing, exhibit cognitive biases in the way we make sense of the world. For example, to preserve a virtuous self-image, each of us routinely displays what psychologists refer to as a fundamental attribution error, whereby we take the credit for good outcomes while blaming others for bad ones. This inherent drive to protect our ego, to act and think in ways that make us feel better about ourselves, has been comprehensively exploited to make us conform with coronavirus restrictions. These effects can be seen in many of the campaigns and strategies employed by the UK government this year. I interviewed psychologist Gary Sidley, who has also authored an excellent article about Mindspace, and behavioral scientists Patrick Fagan and Richard Shotton, and Dr. Ashley Frawley, senior lecturer in sociology and social policy at Swansea University in Wales, to discuss the government messaging. A central tenet of this book is that the use of fear to create compliance is ethically dubious and, at the very least, warrants public debate. In a short window of time, behavioral psychology has become core to how the UK government does business, and these days it's the business of fear. The psychologists are operating in ethically murky waters in implementing their nudges, without our consent, to promote mass acceptance of infringements on our basic human freedoms, said Gary Sidley. The ethics of nudging deserve their own consultation but are even more worthy of scrutiny when one considers the ongoing carnage associated with the elevated fear levels. See Chapter 16, Terrifying Impacts, for more on the carnage. Frawley told me that she believes the deliberate manipulation of our emotions affects our deepest existential questions. The ability to manage our emotional lives is not entrusted to us. Behavioral scientist Richard Shotton, author of The Choice Factory, was more sanguine about nudging. I asked him to talk me through some of the highs and lows of the behavioral science approach during the COVID epidemic. Overall, he argued that behavioral insights are an effective tool to shape communications. As you have to choose how to communicate, you may as well do it in a way that will engineer the desired results. Shotton offered the example of social proof, which is the norms effect. He told me that people can be seen as slightly silly for following these biases, but if they were misleading or useless, we wouldn't follow them. In essence, social proof is a remarkably useful tactic, and has helped humans stay alive in our evolutionary past. These days, for example, you can't weigh up every single purchase in the supermarket. It would take a phenomenal amount of time and be an illogical approach. Social proof, simply doing what most other people do, is a faster way of making choices. As Edward Bernays put it, it would be ideal if all of us could make up our minds independently by evaluating all pertinent facts objectively. That, however, is not possible. Likewise, Patrick Fagan, author of Hooked and former lead psychologist at Cambridge Analytica, told me, most people can't deal with the facts. We have limited brain power, we can only think about so much. So rational appeals to the general public are less effective than nudging. Talking in concrete emotional terms is more effective. So, did he think the government's nudging had been ethical? I'm talking about my own profession here, but behavioral science has become egregious. At the moment it is about fundamentally changing how people live and taking away their freedoms. The Nudge Unit have appointed themselves as the Ministry of Choice and have decided to do the deciding for everyone else. In David Halpern's book, Inside the Nudge Unit, when he considers the ethics of this, he says you don't ask children if they want to learn to read and write, you just teach them to do it. I think it shows he thinks of the population as being like children. I asked Fagan if he thought the government were relying on fear when other forms of persuasion were possible. He agreed that there are many ways to nudge. You can appeal to duty. You can use reciprocity. The older generation did this for you. You can do something in return. And fear has been overplayed. But emotion is the steam in the engine that drives behavior, and fear is the oldest and strongest emotion. How is fear confected? How exactly have our minds been nudged to influence our behavior? Here are some examples from the myriad UK government mind control campaigns. Fright Night. The behavioral psychologists advised that the sense of personal threat had to be ramped up at the end of March. The Prime Minister's Doomsday SP. Each was scripted to do just that, by inducing fear and evoking war and authoritarianism. Chapter 1, Fright Night, details this. From that point onwards, the risk of death was energetically amplified, particularly during the 6 p.m. and 10 p.m. news broadcasts and on newspaper front pages. The Downing Street briefings were characterized by authority figures in suits on raised podiums and yellow and black chevron signage warning danger, danger, danger. While the number of deaths in the UK to date is sobering, the British people have vastly overestimated the risk to themselves from COVID-19. The country has been locked down or under restrictions one way or another for most of a year, and it was Boris Johnson's speech that first set the framework for that miscalculation. Heroes. COVIDIOTS and slogans. The media resounded with a dialectical theme of heroes and COVIDiots during the epidemic. Heroes was used repeatedly to praise people following the rules, inspiring community activists and frontline workers. Praising heroes is laudable, but what is determined to be heroism is key, and heroism consisted mainly of following the rules and following a nascent creed of safetyism and collectivism. A BBC film on 25 December celebrated London's 2020 Pandemic Heroes. 11 slogans on government and NHS advertising appealed to heroic altruism. Stay home, protect the NHS, save lives, protect your loved ones. I wash my hands to protect my nan. I wash my hands to protect my family. I wear a face covering to protect my mates. I make space to protect you. Heroism and altruism appeal to norms, as we all want to be in the right crowd. Ego is affected as the terms and framing equate compliance with virtue. The slogans themselves work through salience, as they are simple and catchy. We're hardwired to notice what is distinctive. Roadside signs commanded us to stay alert. This was distinctive for a while. To start with, I noticed my local illuminated stay alert sign each time I drove past it, although I'm sure I wasn't alone in wondering what I was supposed to be alert to exactly while driving my car. After a couple of months, I felt irritated by the relentlessly glowing stay alert signage. After another couple of months, it was no more than roadside wallpaper. It had lost salience. Instructional slogans also came in triadic structures, because of the power of three. Rhyme and repetition are proven to increase believability. They afford statements an enhancement in processing fluency that can be misattributed to heightened conviction about their truthfulness. 12 The term COVIDiot emerged early on to describe people behaving stupidly or irresponsibly. Or you can swap COVIDiot for selfish moron or granny killer. The Urban Dictionary website has a selection of definitions, including this: dour piety, an individual who in the face of dire circumstances for all, acts selfishly toward others instead of in solidarity and with generosity. Through affect, people will not want to be in the disliked deviant group. The negative labeling ensures that the altruistic majority who are openly conforming with the rules will blame any subsequent increase in coronavirus cases or deaths on those who didn't comply, while themselves taking the credit for any positive change in the statistics. The COVIDiots and lockdown skeptics become responsible for the virus being a hard-to-control virus, or the ineffectiveness of unproven non-pharmaceutical interventions. Scapegoating is convenient. As I explained in Chapter 4, fear is a page of the government playbook. The use of othering and dehumanizing language can go on to have tragic consequences. Patrick Fagan told me that in an analysis of the Rwandan genocide, one of the first linguistic predictors was the tendency to look backwards, to blame, and to focus on past wrongs and injustices, and he had noticed similar precursors in the language of blame during the COVID epidemic. This sounds extreme, but it's important to at least be aware of these linguistic signposts. They have always led us down the ugliest roads in human history. When pubs reopened in the summer, the 4th of July 2020 was characterized as Independence Day, implying an entitlement to excess and conveying disapproval. Pubgoers were derided in the media as wanton and selfish, the classic COVIDiots. Even if no rules had been broken, the sight of people enjoying a convivial drink was heavily criticized by pious, lockdown zealots. It's worth noting that when we are influenced by norms and coalesce into a group, a herd, we are easier to govern. It isn't a stated aim of the behavioral psychologists, but it's an undeniable effect. And it makes spotting the dissenters all the easier. Scary slogans also used the effects of incentives and effect to deter rule breaking. If you go out, you can spread it. People will die, don't kill granny. Coronavirus. Anyone can get it. Anyone can spread it. Don't let a coffee cost lives. I felt a whiplash of shock when I first saw the "Don't Kill Granny" campaign. It was simultaneously insensitive to the youngsters who have lost grandparents, and placed a jaw-slackening burden on the others. I felt a visceral maternal need to reassure my children that they were not responsible for the deaths of the elderly. One son told me in response that a teacher at school had shouted at non-mask wearers in the corridor that they were killing people. Killing people would warrant calling the police, would it not? In fact, teenagers were merely making their way from one lesson to the next. Has this kind of hysterical and accusatory attitude towards our children been fueled by government-initiated campaigns? I contacted Professor Ellen Townsend, who heads up the self-harm research group within the School of Psychology at the University of Nottingham about the granny-killing catchphrase. After a long pause, I sensed she had a lot to say and was composing herself. She responded, "It is an unethical and morally repugnant slogan that compassionate, holistic public health researchers would never endorse. Using fear to psychologically manipulate people, especially children, is unlikely to engender trust in science or future public health messaging." To maximize the impact of scary slogans, the posters displaying dire warnings have often been accompanied by images of emergency personnel wearing medical masks and visors, stark black and white imagery and bold typefaces. The use of red and especially yellow and black have been typical of the scary advertising, as they suggest danger and threat. Yellow and black chevron-edged images remind us of painful wasp stings as well as disaster area cordons. Beware. Do not cross the rules, for on the other side of this chevron lies pain. Patrick Fagan observed that some of the language used in the slogans might also be intended to bamboozle us. The term, social distancing, is oxymoronic. Distance is not social. In Australia, the advice was even more Orwellian: staying apart keeps us together. The confusion aroused by this type of bamboozlement means you are more likely to be compliant to the command. Cautionary tales and case studies. The media focused on case studies which serve as cautionary tales. Stray from the rules and all will not go well. Patient in Wales makes coronavirus plea. I didn't believe it was this bad. Sky News, the 26th of January 2020. Man who believed virus was hoax loses wife to COVID-19. BBC, the 24th of August 2020. Mum who didn't believe in COVID-19 struggles to breathe after 22 days in hospital. Mirror, the 20th of October 2020. Clapping your hands and shouting you believe in Tinkerbell doesn't keep fairies alive, and simply believing COVID is a dangerous respiratory disease doesn't keep you alive either. Of course, people needed to take sensible precautions and follow the law and guidance, but if being frightened enough to follow all the rules was enough to keep people safe, far fewer would have died. These lurid headlines and cautionary tales are designed to frighten people into following the rules. Look at what happens to those who didn't believe hard enough. But do the media do this at the express bidding of the government? In Chapter 2, Fear Spread in the Media Like an Airborne Virus, I explored the complex and interconnected relationship between the media and the government. In addition, do the behavioral scientists have a direct line to some journalists? During a Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee on the 19th of January 2021, 13 MPs put questions to David Halpern of BIT and Stephen Riker, professor of social psychology, both of whom sit on SPIB. Riker referenced a relationship with the media a few times. He mentioned a specific and early case in the media. A nurse crying in distress in the first wave was immensely important in getting us to understand the realities on the front line. I have been arguing for the need for more of these, including stories of compliance. He reiterated later that he wanted more stories of the public's, compliance. He said he had argued on Radio 4's Today program that they needed more such stories, and to be fair to the Today program, over the next few days they had stories of everyday heroic compliance. Riker seems to exert some influence. Fines: we can't credit the nudgers with the invention of punitive fines. We've always had them. Although, without exaggeration, the COVID fines are the worst this country has seen since the wergid or blood money of the Dark Ages. In fact, the behavioral scientists seem to prefer carrot to stick, al. Though fines would fall under the heading of coercion, in the recommendations from SPIB. The problem is that laws to compel compliance must of necessity involve punishments for non-compliance. And Halpern believes that it does matter that egregious examples are enforced. 32,329 FPNs, fixed penalty notice fines, were issued under the Health Protection, Coronavirus, Restrictions, Regulations, England and Wales and handed out by police between the 27th of March and the 21st of December 2020. Seeding. The Overton window. A foot in the door and boiling frog seeding is the art of planting an idea like a seed, to let it grow. Later your audience is ready for the sale, or the next COVID restrictions, as the case may be. Leading on from that is the foot in the door technique. Once someone has agreed to one request, it is harder to refuse the next bigger request, as a precedent for acquiescence and acceptance has been established. Both seating and foot in the door are tools which can manipulate what is known as the Overton window. This is the model for a framework which can shift and expand the policies that a government can follow without alienating their electorate. Once the idea is seated, and the foot is in the door, it means you can be boiled like frogs. The boiling frog metaphor was famously used in The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. Nothing changes instantaneously. In a gradually heating bathtub you'd be boiled to death before you knew it. In the biggest example of how these terms have played out in the COVID epidemic, we started with a single lockdown for 3 weeks to flatten the curve, which itself transformed into many weeks and, one way or another, we lived under restrictions for over a year by the time of publication. Currently we are in a lockdown which has no guaranteed end date or exit strategy. Whether through bumbling incompetence and lack of planning, or through a covert foot in the door agenda, or combination of all of it, the fact is that a 3-week lockdown was the seed for a much longer term and more drastic arrangement. We were told that masks didn't work, and that they were even a bad idea, because you trap the virus and breathe it in, and that they can also increase transmission. We were told they would not be introduced. But even saying that we wouldn't have to wear masks planted the seed of an idea about mask wearing. Then, despite no new conclusive evidence in their favor, masks were mandated on public transport, then in shops. Just before this mandate there were seemingly coordinated, or oddly coincidental, calls from politicians and scientists. The Royal Society issued a report and press release urging the adoption of masks, although it concentrated on behavioral psychology and messaging rather than hard evidence. In fact, it had to note that uptake had been depressed by a lack of evidence-based medicine in favor of masks. Sadiq Khan asked for masks to be legally required. Once mandated, Matt Hancock said the mask policy would be rolled out in chunks. This was a rare explicit glimpse of the government's considered foot in the door strategizing. The prospect of vaccine passports was also floated, withdrawn, and mentioned again. On the 12th of January 2021, the vaccine minister, Nadeem Zahawi, pledged that there were no plans to introduce vaccine passports. Yet on the 24th of January the Daily Mail reported that 8 companies were in receipt of government funding to develop vaccine passports. Has a seed been planted? What will happen to the ministerial promise? Let's see what grows. Keeping fear in our faces. Face coverings, or masks, appeal to norms and social conformity. The behavioral psychologists love masks. They absolutely love them. They believe they promote collectivism, the feeling that we are all in it together. This attitude, clearly gleaned from my interviews with the SPIB advisors, was confirmed when David Halpern answered M's questions and said, "It took a long time to get people in masks. Our view early on was that masks are effective, not least because of the signal they create and of course the underlying evidence." So, he believed there was evidence in favor of masks, but note that signal comes before evidence. Behavioral scientists pushed for masks because they create a signal, when in fact not a single randomized controlled trial can demonstrate the value of mask wearing outside clinical settings. How does the signal work? Normative pressure is enhanced and sustained when we wear masks in public. They are a visible indicator that there is danger present all around, in the air we breathe and in the people we meet. Masked faces prime you to think of danger. We become walking billboards for disease and danger. They keep fear in our faces. Literally. They also distinguish the compliant from the rebels. Although of course there are many valid reasons, and non-exhaustive legal exemptions, for not wearing a mask. And what of the evidence? At the beginning of the epidemic, politicians and public health leaders around the world told us masks were not effective in the community. England's chief medical officer, Professor Chris Whitty, said, "In terms of wearing a mask, our advice is clear. That wearing a mask if you don't have an infection reduces the risk almost not at all. So we do not advise that." In the U.S., Dr. Anthony Fauci was clear on 8 March 2020 that people should not be walking around with masks. He went on to say that a mask might make people feel better and it might even prevent a droplet, but doesn't give the protection people think and can even increase transmission. But although there was no new hard evidence, policies changed country by country. In England, masks were legally mandated on public transport on 15 June 2020 and then on 24 July in shops, in Scotland on public transport on 22 June and in shops on 10 July, Wales on public transport on 27 July and in shops on 14 September. In a speech on 3 August 2020, WHO Director General Drive, Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus said the mask has come to represent solidarity. What he did not mention was any new evidence behind the policy change. In fact, the WHO's guide, Mask Use in the Context of COVID-19, published on 1 December 2020, said, "At present there is only limited and inconsistent scientific evidence to support the effectiveness of masking of healthy people in the community to prevent infection with respiratory viruses, including SARS-CoV-2. The European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control, ECDC, concurs that evidence regarding the effectiveness of non-medical face masks for the prevention of COVID-19 is scarce." Matt Hancock said that masks give people more confidence to shop safely and enhance protections for those who work in shops. The UK government website does not offer the facts and figures behind the science. It just says that the best available scientific evidence is that face coverings may reduce the spread of coronavirus droplets in certain circumstances, helping to protect others. 26 An MP told me off the record that the health minister had told him that masks were introduced because the economic bounce back was not strong enough after the first lockdown in 2020. It was felt that masks would make people feel safe enough to go shopping. Masks were supposed to serve as an economic stimulus. However, once we were wearing masks it became about social control, because it turned out they reinforced a feeling of abnormal threat and stimulated fear. The reason for wearing masks became inverted. When I spoke to Robert Dingwall, a professor of sociology who advises the government, he told me he was convinced that masks had been introduced partly because they are a symbolic reminder that people are dangerous, the world is dangerous, and you might feel safer at home. They create a sense of threat and danger, and that social interaction might be something to be anxious about. So mandating masks can feed the fear. He agreed that there was little scientific basis for masks and that, in his view, they were designed to make people compliant. I asked about the ethics of that tactic and he retorted that the ethics of it stink. The BPS, British Psychological Society, should be taking a look at it. I'm disappointed that the psychologists have not taken this up. Well, the problem is that at least some of the psychologists wanted us in masks precisely because of the fear signal. A recent large-scale randomized controlled trial in Denmark, effectiveness of adding a mask recommendation to other public health measures to prevent SARS-CoV-2 infection in Danish mask wearers, found no conclusive evidence that masks protect the wearer, although the study was not designed to test whether others could be protected. A doctor wrote about the sobering reality of caring for critically ill COVID patients for news website Unheard. What she said about masks leapt out at me. I then put on my PPE, FFP3 mask, hairnet, long-sleeved gown, gloves, visor, and entered the bay to examine the patients. I feel lucky to have this level of protection. My colleagues outside of the HDU only have surgical masks, which offer little protection against an airborne virus. And there is the acknowledgement from a doctor that a surgical mask, also known as a spit stopper, does little to protect against viruses. I also quizzed Shotton about masks. Even though he is a behavioral psychologist and understands how the subliminal pressure operates, he admitted that, if I walked into a shop wearing a mask and no one else was, I'd be embarrassed. If I wasn't wearing a mask and everyone else was, I'd feel embarrassed. It's difficult to be deviant. People who are obeying the rules often don't like to see others break them. There have been harrowing accounts of people with PTSD or disabilities feeling unable to go about their lives in public unmasked because of aggressive questioning, or the fear that it will happen, despite their legal exemption. Halpern referred to the desirability of this citizen policing when he commented that, most of the heavy lifting is done by the public, frowning at people who aren't wearing masks. The British are particularly good at doing this. The nudgers want us to monitor each other. In an astonishing public admission, Metropolitan Police Commissioner Dame Cressida Dick said she hoped that people would be shamed into complying by other members of the public. She hoped we would shame each other, even though no one can know by looking at another what their reason is for not wearing a mask. In addition to face masks, there are other visible symbols in public which do their part to help prevent transmission, but also prime our behavior in a broader way. Shotton brought up the example of the dots in the supermarket. He told me he likes the dots, because they remove the social ambiguity. You follow prearranged signs. I told him I dislike the dots, and I don't enjoy abundant signage telling me what to do. It feels infantilizing and bossy. Behavioral science doesn't measure whether we like the dots or not, just whether we follow them, he said. I had another one of my breakthroughs. Behavioral science isn't about how we feel. It's not about making us happy. It's not about our attitude. It's about behavior. The clue was in the name all along. Lies, damned lies, and statistics. Numbers, data, statistics and graphs can all, if done well, appeal to salience. They catch our attention if relevant to our personal circumstances and concerns. Simplicity is important because our attention is much more likely to be drawn to things that we can understand. An example of doing this well was when NHS Chief Executive, Simon Stevens, revealed that the UK's health service had prepared the equivalent of 50 hospitals to be ready for people suffering severely from the epidemic. 30. It conveyed scale in a relatable, and reassuring, way. But Simon Stevens doesn't always use this relatable and salient way of helping us visualize the scale of infection. Nosocomial COVID infections, hospital-acquired infections, have been a problem for the NHS and care homes during the epidemic. Hospitals are built like little cities, a far cry from the fever hospitals of yore, and an infectious respiratory disease can spread easily. The NHS has not been transparent about the scale of hospital-acquired infections. I had access to privileged information in mid-January 2021 and wrote for the Daily Mail 31 that since the start of the second wave alone, 25,000 patients had caught COVID while in hospital. That is a staggering number. It's the equivalent of 50 hospitals worth of people. Deaths, hospitalizations and cases were the main metrics discussed in press briefings and in the media. These were not placed in context with recoveries and discharges. Without providing that balance, the overall impression would be that you catch COVID and die, creating more fear. There is so much to say about the use of numbers, percentages and steep-lined graphs that there is a whole chapter devoted to them. Chapter 10, The Metrics of Fear. The New Variant, U-Turns and the Christmas That Never Was. Professor Hugh Pennington of the University of Aberdeen accused the government of waging a propaganda campaign to get the public scared enough to follow lockdown measures. He said, "It is all very frustrating. In my heart of hearts I believe there is a propaganda campaign to get the public very scared." In mid-December 2020, Matt Hancock warned that the new variant was 70% more infectious and behind a surge in cases in London and the southeast. Various scientists urged calm, reiterated that viruses do mutate, and that there was no evidence yet that this particular variant was more transmissible or deadly. On the 16th of December, the government performed a U-turn and changed the rules for Christmas, reducing the number of households that could meet from 3 to 2. Pennington confessed he thought the new variant had become a very handy excuse for canceling Christmas as rates were rising. In fact, it is extremely hard to prove transmissibility without infecting people with the virus, which would be unethical. If the Kentish COVID variant was indeed used to justify changing the rules for Christmas, this is an example of placebo information, another behavioral psychology tool. New strains provide a psychological justification for actions the government may wish to take anyway. Worryingly, the virus will always mutate and produce new variants, which can justify action before the new variants are fully understood. A government could keep new variant bait and switch policies going for as long as there are viruses. That's forever, by the way. U-turns were typical during the epidemic. This can be very reasonably explained and justified by the twists and turns of following the science during a new epidemic. But uncertainty is also a form of bamboozlement and is akin to the tactics used in psychological warfare. On the 5th of November 2020, Boris Johnson said, "These rules will expire on the 2nd of December, about the second lockdown." But on the 16th of November, Matt Hancock said, "It's too early to say." This flip-flopping and good cop, bad cop routine was a feature of the government messaging. I talked to the UK's leading disaster and recovery specialist, Lucy Easthope. She's a senior lecturer on disaster recovery and mass fatalities and has advised the government on COVID-19, as well as Grenfell, the Salisbury Novichok poisoning and the Manchester bombing. She told me this is some of the worst psychological torture I have seen. Christmas is on. It's off, it's on. It's not unusual in disaster recovery to go back and forth. In disaster recovery we say the kindest thing you can do is make one decision early. The government are making one of the big classic disaster recovery mistakes. It's not possible to know whether there was a lack of coordination between ministers, a lack of planning, or a deliberate plan to confuse. Regardless, it had the effect of creating a level of uncertainty which was bad for business and bad for mental health. We house some of the most advanced behavioral science in the world in our government. Surely the comparison to psychological torture would not be missed? The lack of certainty about lockdown finish lines could arguably be said to create a more stressed and therefore compliant population. It is probably reasonable to assume the UK government's COVID U-turns were due at different times to both a lack of planning and psychological manipulation. On the 11th of February 2020, Matt Hancock said that the clinical advice about the risk to the public has not changed and remains moderate. Of course, we all know about the U-turn that followed on the 23rd of March. Did he and the government respond to the science, but also to public opinion, polling and media pressure? Some of the worst doom-mongering ads. We have endured a year of fear thanks to the government's COVID advertising campaign. Extreme, visceral and deliberately frightening TV, radio, poster and print advertising were designed to elevate your sense of threat and risk and encourage obedience to the rules. Using fear in advertising is controversial because it can be distressing and harmful. The Advertising Standards Authority states in its advertising codes that advertising must minimize the risk of causing harm or serious or widespread offense. There are specific guidelines regarding fear. Marketing communications must not cause fear or distress without justifiable reason. If it can be justified, the fear or distress should not be excessive. Marketers must not use a shocking claim or image merely to attract attention. Some of the government's advertising is flagrantly in breach of the ASA code, as you will see in some of the worst doom-mongering ads I noted throughout the year. Sociologist Dr. Ashley Frawley conducted a brief semiotic analysis of the government's advertising and described its trajectory to me. The first hard-hitting campaign showed yellow and red caution tape and a healthcare worker in a mask which looks like a gas mask. This is trying to tell you that this is very serious indeed. There is a horror movie dystopian quality to it. In another campaign they used a raspy, stern male voice, telling you, people will die. By the summer the advertising is using a woman's voice. The tone is upbeat. There's whistling. You're being told to enjoy summer. Then in September, October, we were back to a more stern actor, signaling the tension and the risk are building again. It's like an abusive relationship. Uh-oh, something is about to happen. In January, the stern, raspy voice man is back. As Frawley said, a dominant tactic of the campaign was not just to say that you are at risk, but more importantly, you are a risk. It is dark messaging indeed to tell us we are responsible for killing other people, including our loved ones. George left the pub, and went home to kill his dad. Sasha had a great night out at her friend's house, and popped in to kill her nan on the way home. Once Aide's finished keeping fit, he'll go home to kill his mum over dinner. Stop. Horrified? Of course. But would you feel different if their weapon of choice was COVID-19? Coronavirus is killing people every day. Not adhering to public health guidelines is a principal cause of the spread of coronavirus. COVID kills. And you don't have to have symptoms to spread it. Protect the lives of friends, family, neighbors, and the community. Don't bring COVID home this Christmas. This is the wording from a sensationalized video produced for social media and shared by a counselor at Haringey Council. Someone jogging, walking their dog or working out in the park is highly likely to have COVID-19. This is a national health emergency. Around 1 in 3 people have no symptoms and are spreading it without knowing. So exercise locally. If you bend the rules, people will die. This government radio advertisement was withdrawn after complaints to the Advertising Standards Authority as the claims were misleading and could not be substantiated. However, no apology or correction was ever issued. Many millions of people might still think these false claims are true and be unnecessarily frightened or concerned. Santa lies unconscious in hospital, surrounded by NHS staff. He is saved. Thereby Christmas itself is saved. And he rewards a nurse with a surprise Christmas present. The Santa ad created for NHS charities was incredibly divisive. Some people found it moving, while others felt it was insensitive and would disturb children. Surely it's misleading, as Santa is magical and therefore can't get ill or die. Anyway, it was withdrawn to avoid further controversy. Don't let a coffee cost lives hyperbole on a double shot of caffeine. Meeting a friend for a walk with a takeaway coffee has never been illegal and has been some people's lifeline during long lockdowns. This advertisement could have frightened and deterred people from a helpful act of socialization. The exaggeration might not help engender long-term trust in the government. Look him in the eyes, and tell him you always keep a safe distance. Look her in the eyes, and tell her you never bend the rules. Look him in the eyes, and tell him the risk isn't real. A poster, print and broadcast campaign shows people wearing oxygen masks looking straight into camera. The tight close-up and the eye contact are designed to take you straight into their predicament. The grainy processing is evocative of horror, like an upscale Blair Witch Project. This campaign didn't just leverage fear, but also guilt and shame, pitting the sick against the perpetrator. Othering the offensive disease spreaders could create ill will and conflict. And maybe it was no one's fault. Maybe he got COVID while in hospital for a hernia operation. Maybe she caught COVID while working in a care home. Grassroots campaigners against lockdown, recovery, commissioned an independent poll from market research company Yonder and found that 15% of respondents reported depression, anxiety, or fear as a direct result of government pandemic advertising. A further 7% reported that the advertising has made an existing mental health condition worse. That's almost 12 million people around the country whose mental health has been damaged by an unprecedented government advertising campaign designed to create fear. And 3% said that the advertising has brought on an entirely new mental health condition requiring treatment.